Hi all, Dr. Nordling here, coming to you from my living room. Welcome to our online distance learning day one. I know that this is a weird experience for all of us. This is the first time I'm definitely using this medium, but we're going to get through it together. You're going to learn a lot about human development. I'm still going to be here for you any way that I can. So obviously just please make sure to reach out, contact me, come to office hours if you can make it during those times. I want to help you in any way that I can. It's really important through this whole process that we're supporting one another, and you know, this is a challenging time. This brings me to that second point on the slide right here, is to stay healthy, and I really do mean that physically and mentally. As a psychologist, we know how important it is to lessen our stress loads because stress doesn't make us our best selves. So if I can help in any way, I can't help you physically, but psychologically, mentally, I've got your back, and I want to continue to do so. So again, welcome to day one. We're going to get through this together, and it's going to be an experience. That's what we're going to talk about. So yeah, welcome. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about cognitive development in adolescence. And again, just to put this into context, we're using the biopsychosocial model to understanding human development as it relates to the period known as adolescence. So we've already covered puberty, and those are some of the biological aspects of development. Cognitive development obviously is also going to be biological in some ways. We're going to be talking about some changes that occur in the brain. But cognitive development also involves how we think and how we process information. And so there's definitely more of a psychological component. Before we get into that, you know how I like to show little comics, and there are so many for adolescents. And so let's look at this one for a second. Anatomy of a teenager's brain. We see the biggest part of the brain, according to this comic, is the birds and the bees lobe. So all we're doing is thinking about sex and adolescence. We also have the Rebellion Center, a super turbo Rebellion Center, the Center of the Universe Center, the Cool Gauge, memory for music. You see the judgment gland right by the eye is entirely too small. We're going to talk about that. Do adolescents make good decisions? Are they higher in risk-taking behaviors? Going back up to the top, we see self-image, which it says prone to bruising. There's this fitting in gland, worried about your peers. Internet and phone addictions, every episode of the Simpsons. Indestructibility cortex. So again, maybe that goes along with the judgment gland. And then peer pressure resistance, maybe that goes along with this judgment gland, and so on. So the purpose of today's discussion is to see how accurate this depiction really is. Certainly there are some stereotypes here, certainly there may be some realities, but the topic today, cognitive development, is going to unveil some of these findings from a research perspective. First question I want you to think about right now is, are adolescents bigger risk takers than adults? Had we been in class, we would use this as a time for a class discussion, but just think about this for a second. If you believe that adolescents are bigger risk takers than adults, then what are the factors that you think could lead to this risk-taking behavior? And perhaps I just talked about some in the comic that we saw in the previous slide. If not, why do we have that perception? So if adolescents aren't bigger risk takers, or maybe you can argue that we don't have that perception, maybe it's not a stereotype. So just think about that for a second. Do you think that adolescents are bigger risk takers? And remember, we're thinking about a time period from the preteen years, maybe around the age of 10, to all the way to about 25. Are adolescents bigger risk takers? To first answer the question if adolescents are bigger risk takers, wanted to go to some data. So the data on this particular slide comes from the Center for Disease Control, an organization we've been hearing about a lot lately. But they, from time to time, collect data on a group of adolescents. So you see here, these are 9th, 12th to 12th graders, so high schoolers. And this is a nationally representative sample. This means that we're not just looking at, white adolescents from the Midwest. This is a sample of adolescents, a large sample from urban areas, rural areas, West Coast, East Coast, a representative of different races and backgrounds. And the reason that this is beneficial to look at it from this way is we have more of a generalized sample. Um, this is from 2015, and that's because that's the most recent that I have seen a report come out based on adolescents from the CDC. But we could argue if 2015 data would still be representative of data today in 2020. I think in a lot of ways it's still these numbers would look comparable in 2020 data, but again, we can argue for that if we don't think that that's true. And I just wanted to present some statistics. So in the last 30 days, how many of these adolescents, again, let's say 14-year-olds to 18-year-olds, reported that they rarely or never wore a seat belt? Usually when I ask this question in a classroom setting before showing you the actual number, the numbers are still tend to be, or students still say it's pretty low. And you see here that it's just 6%. Again, though, this is self-report data, so keep that in mind for all of these questions, that sometimes adolescents may exaggerate and the numbers here are actually higher than reality, or not just here, but in any self-report data. And sometimes the numbers are lower and don't actually reflect what is happening in reality. Next item. In the last 30 days, how many of these adolescents reported riding in a car with someone who had been drinking? And so specifically, this was talking about a driver who had been drinking. And you see here that the percentage says 20%. So in the last month, 20% report being in a car with a driver who had been drinking. Obviously a note on the way that this question is worded, and this is a really important part about research methods and how a researcher goes about asking questions. First of all, we don't know. Does this mean that the driver had one drink with dinner? Or does this mean that the driver had a whole bottle with dinner? Doesn't specify. Also doesn't specify if it was a peer who was driving or a parent. Not necessarily saying that would matter, but it just doesn't specify. So keep that in mind with that 20%. I feel like that 20% sounds high, but what is the question really asking? Nevertheless, it's still a sizable percentage. Next one, though, I think is a little bit scarier. In the last 30 days, how many of them carried a weapon? And you see here that 16.2% endorsed that item. If we were in class, we often hear conversations from students saying like, well, does it count if you have pepper spray with you? Is that a weapon? What about a little pocket knife, like not necessarily one, like a Swiss Army knife? It doesn't specify, obviously, in this question from the CDC, but still 16.2% sounds pretty sizable. Next question. In the last 30 days, had 5 or more drinks of alcohol within a couple of hours. So obviously this would be an episode of binge drinking. And we see 17.7% of adolescents in the sample endorse that. If we were looking at just 12th graders, that number would be higher. But since this sample is including 9th graders through 12th graders, obviously the 9th graders are tending to drink less, and so that percentage is going to be affected by those individuals. Question 5. Taken prescription drugs without a prescription, so one that wasn't prescribed to you, one or more times during their life. And so for this one, it's not necessarily in the last month, but just in your life. And we see 16.8% endorse this item. Depending on where you are in the country, this value is going to vary. Number 6, I don't necessarily think this question is necessarily indicative of risk-taking behavior. I think it's more, it can be typical adolescent behavior. But let's just look at the numbers. So had sex with at least one person during the last 3 months. And we see 30.1% of adolescents in the CDC sample endorse that. The problem one though comes with number 7. And number 7 is did not use for those this is only for those individuals who reported that they engaged in sexual behavior, said that did not use any method to prevent pregnancy during the last time they had sex. And we see almost 14% are saying the last time I had sex, I did not use any form of protection. And I think that this is something that warrants concern and something we'll talk about more when we get to adolescent sexuality in just a few class periods. So in short though, what do these numbers represent? Do these represent individuals who are risk takers? Do they look different in an adult sample? Obviously we don't have that data in front of us. What does this really say? What can we take away from these numbers about adolescent cognitive development? So think about that for a second and think about that as we get into more of the conversation today. Before you click on to see the actual values, just write down in your margin or on a sheet of paper your guesses for the following responses. So there's 7 questions. This is a sample of 9th to 12th graders. Record what percentage you would guess would respond yes to the following questions. And then after you do that, you can click and hear me talking through each of these questions and also providing some data. In this video, you're going to be hearing about some research from the lab of Larry Steinberg. When I used to teach adolescent development, Steinberg actually wrote that book, and he's actually really well known in the field of adolescent development. As you watch this video, you're going to learn a little bit more about risk-taking behaviors in adolescence, and more specifically, the role that peers play when adolescents are deciding whether or not to engage in risk-taking behaviors. For the remainder of this lecture, we're going to be following this outline. We're going to be talking about the different areas of change, different things that happen in adolescent thinking and processing of information. Then we're going to be talking about developmental theories of cognition, just briefly. We'll be talking about specific changes in the brain, and then we're going to bring it all back to risk-taking behaviors, keeping in mind the video that you just watched and the data from the CDC.